All right, guys, my special guest tonight is Dr. Jill Stein. She's a physician, activist, and former Green Party presidential candidate. Welcome back, Jill. Thanks so much for coming on.
Great to be with you, Sabby. Seems like you never stop. I think your schedule is 24/7. You seem to be broadcasting constantly. And we're a better world for it.
Yeah, it feels that way sometimes. It's really interesting. I saw you at the Rage Against the War Machine rally. I got a chance to speak to you there, and then I saw you at the Julian Assange documentary premiere in Somerville as well. So I think you've been pretty busy too.
Just trying to keep up with you, Sabby.
All right, Jill. So I wanted to talk to you tonight about this conflict with Russia and Ukraine and this recent agreement with Xi Jinping and Putin, and whether or not this could be a pathway towards some type of peace. And also, where do we go in reference to the anti-war movement, and how can we build a larger coalition? But in reference to this agreement between Putin and Jinping, where do you think that this is going? And is this a positive thing, or do you feel there are negative parts about this agreement as well?
You know, from my familiarity with it, which is only, very broad brushstroke, I think it's pretty great. Its bottom line is to ensure the security of all the critical players, and that has to be worked out in detail in negotiations. One of the best things about it, I think, is that Zelensky has indicated an interest, to the horror of the U.S. Department of Defense, military, State Department, et cetera, deep state. They don't like this idea of peace. And what's his name? John Kirby, the spokesperson for the National Security Council, was quoted as saying, basically, oh my God, that would just be the worst thing in the world if a ceasefire comes out of this, which tells you really, how believable all this lip service is that the U.S. gives to the sovereignty of Ukraine, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, which has been used as the reason why we can't have negotiations and we can't, we can't slow things down. It's all in Ukraine's hands, they've been saying, the US has been saying. But now that Ukraine is interested in this peace deal that Xi put on the table, now it's suddenly, oh no, it's not about Ukraine's sovereignty. It's about keeping the war effort on. It's outrageous. So that is very exciting, and Putin has expressed interest in it as well. We sort of see hope breaking out around the world, with the US kind of being bypassed. We have a lot of weapons to sell, as you know, and that's kind of our prime directive, is to get out there and sell weapons. And of course, we are the biggest weapons dealer and have been, forever, I think. But also, as Martin Luther King described, we are the greatest purveyor of violence the world has ever known. And those two things kind of come together in our agenda to prevent peace. And we have done that at every turn, really, with Russia. Since the Second World War, we have really been on a crusade to either provoke war or to essentially strong arm Russia or the Soviet Union out of existence. And I know well, Sabby, about the US military doctrine called full spectrum dominance, where they did us the favor, the US military, the Pentagon did us the favor of taking the guesswork out of it. They made it absolutely clear what the driver is here for the United States. And going back as far as 1992, which is the first time I've seen it really spelled out, the Pentagon plan was published in the New York Times, at least excerpts of it, saying that the US will not tolerate any competitors, economically or militarily. We will not tolerate competitors rising in a region or globally. No competitors are allowed. So we have been in the business of basically keeping Russia down or dismantling Russia, as the case may be. And so in the case of Ukraine, this war, which really dates back to 2014 and in some ways before then as well, Ukraine has had really a long-standing civil war that goes far beyond my timeline of history, personally, my own knowledge, but certainly going back to 2014, the active war, the hot war began at that point after a U.S. Supported, perhaps instigated coup where Victoria Nuland revealed in all her glory how she was micromanaging the outcome of that coup and exactly who would be in power and who would not. And there it was for the whole world to see. That's just an example of how, this war, which is now, a hot war and verging on a superpower hot war as well. It has been long in the making and, has really, it's kind of an inevitable consequence of full spectrum dominance and the fact that Russia has resources and Russia has an economy and Russia has, a lot of oil and fossil fuels and also produces grain and so on. So Russia is a power by virtue of its size, its location, its resources, and it has been in the target hairs of the US for quite, for really as far back as we can go on that account. So, to your first question, is there hope in this plan, in Xi's plan? Absolutely, there is. And as China is rising in stature with the current peace proposal in Ukraine, on top of another peace proposal that they actually just implemented, producing an accord between Iran and Saudi Arabia, who've been at each other's throats for a long time. China is taking a very different position from the United States. The United States is selling a lot of weapons and keeping its competitors down. And that doesn't make for peace in the world or anywhere. And now that China is acquiring the momentum and the stature to actually begin really, ushering the peace process, it's a very hopeful development. There are also prospects of peace between Syria and Iran, and also at through the auspices of, actually that one I think is being promoted by Russia. But in terms of China's deal, the news just came out today, the first I saw it, that basically the war in Yemen is shutting down. And that again is very much thanks to the peace accord that China established between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So the outcome of that is that they're now suddenly willing to deal with each other and to, create a peace process before the United States could even get its own act together, to begin withdrawing its support and the weapons that it is throwing into that war and the intelligence and refueling and all sorts of resources that have really enabled us to keep that war going so we can sell more weapons, maintain chaos in the world. So more power to China. And I'm glad that they are standing up and making peace possible. Your other question about the anti-war movement, this is why we really need, well, there are a million reasons why we really need an anti-war movement. The war machine and the war in Ukraine are unbelievably dangerous and harmful. It's really a double whammy to people around the world, but in particular here in the United States. This war and the war machine it's part of are impoverishing and endangering every one of us. It is not a war that Adam Schiff would have you think is a war over there. It is a war that is proceeding down the slippery slope rather quickly towards a nuclear engagement. And you know, it's just not understood, I think, at all, and the press certainly pays this no attention, that it doesn't take much in terms of nuclear detonations to trigger nuclear winter. In other words, when a nuclear bomb goes off, it kicks up a lot of debris that goes up into the sky high enough that it's above the weather. So the rain and the winds are not going to wash it down. So that dust and debris is up there way high. I think it's called the stratosphere. And it creates a veil so that sunshine can't come in. And if sunshine can't come in, then we don't grow food. And depending how much is kicked up, and by the way, it doesn't stay over Ukraine or stay over Russia. It's distributed around the globe. So if U.S. Predator politicians in all of their glory who are saying, you know, basically, you know, let them have the nukes, you know, just nuke them, you know, and there's been a fair amount of that discussion. They're really talking about nuking ourselves, because to the extent that we kick up that dust and debris, and it doesn't take many nuclear detonations to kind of reach that critical threshold. And in fact, you know, the size bomb, the nuclear bombs that went off in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those were about 15 to 20 kilotons is the term that's used. Kilo is 1,000 tons of dynamite, basically. They were equivalent to 15 kilotons. Well, now nuclear weapons are as much as 1,000 times stronger. So it doesn't take many of these big bombs to, in fact, if a maximum bomb was used, and it's believed that Moscow and New York City, Washington, D.C., the important, you know, so-called important large cities, that they are targeted with not just 1 megaton, but more like 20 megatons. So these are just ginormous. It doesn't even, I mean, even one of those would basically wipe out 250,000 people.
Yep.
These are, you know, these are the numbers that have been crunched by the scientists who are in the best position to do that number crunching, and that's what they come up with. We cannot afford to have nuclear engagements, and so that's one of the reasons why we got to stop it. And, you know, how do we do that? We've got to build that movement. You know, in my view, these movements are inseparable, because we are really at the breaking point, not only with regard to war and militarism and nuclear weapons, but also, you know, with regard to the economy and healthcare and, you know, and just the many forms of injustice, 500,000 people on the street every night without housing, you know, that we're really at the breaking point. And I think the name of the game is for the movements for peace and justice to be working together, and not to mention the climate, you know, catastrophe. We're really at the breaking point on every one of these existential issues: crushing inequality, climate collapse, endless war, and, you know, generally the assault on democracy and rising authoritarianism. You know, we need a movement. We need a lot of what's going on in France, which is also going on now in Greece and in Spain. In the UK, the transportation workers are on strike. You know, as RBN has been saying, and you've been saying, many of us have been saying for many, many years, we need to build the capacity for the general strike. And at the end of the day, I think that is what's going to change policy, because the oligarchy has a stranglehold right now on our electeds. The bums need to be thrown out, but the system is so rigged that you can't throw them out.
Right.
So, we need a social movement on top of a political rebellion.
I agree. One of the things that's been really interesting in reference to the sanctions. So the US government put sanctions on Russia. But what has happened is that it's actually not hurting Russia as much as they thought it would, but it is hurting other countries. So, for example, North Korea just announced, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, they are experiencing a food shortage, and apparently it's really bad. And part of that is because of the fact that they do rely on fertilizer from Russia in order to grow food. So there's an issue there with North Korea. People in the UK have told me that they can't afford to pay their heating bills. So they're going to facilities in the UK called warm banks, where they go there to get heat. This is really crazy when you think about it. And then they go back home to a cold house or cold apartment. So it seems like the sanctions that the US government put on Russia is actually hurting other countries more than it's hurting Russia.
That's right. And, it's hurting us too, and has really just added another dimension to the economic pain that so many people are feeling in this country. The lower 50% of our income spectrum has 2% of the wealth in this country. 2% of our wealth and resources are distributed among 50% of the people, and the top 10%, is hoarding 70%. So this is a very bad picture from the get-go. And then you add to that food prices and energy, which are skyrocketing, and this has everything to do with sanctions, war, which has disrupted supply chains, and corporate greed, which has taken, advantage of having an excuse to raise prices. So this is, it's really become, just a disaster. And your point, Sabby, about sanctions causing hunger, the numbers are said to double globally. So there are now 350 million people who are at serious risk of, food insecurity. And you take that food insecurity, it doesn't take much to push those people over the edge. Add a little bit of war, add, like the U.S. severe sanctions to Afghanistan. First we destroy that country, and then we hoard their foreign deposits. We hoard that and prevent them from having access to it, like we've done to Venezuela as well. It's no wonder that the countries of the global South are so ready to welcome China to the global stage as an alternative economy, as an alternative currency. You probably heard that Brazil and China have just agreed to trade in Chinese currency. And we're going to see this happening all over the place. So get ready, USA. USA has been telling the world, we're the leader, respect us. It's our rules-based order. It's not international law anymore. It's rules-based order, which is whatever we declare it is whenever we want. It's a joke that we have been usurping leadership as basically, a thug, as really an international, mafia. Really, just kind of the bully, the strong arm guy. So, it's no wonder that the nations of the world are, they want an end to sanctions, and they're looking for another currency, and they're looking for another system. So, it's like the US made this bed for itself. And if they weren't such, what should I say, psychopaths, sociopaths, they're just, it's like mind-boggling that they treat the world the way that they do. It's, you couldn't get away with that in any kind of a of a community, and any kind of a face-to-face community, this sort of abuse would not be tolerated. So, it's just no surprise. Suddenly people are saying, hey, that emperor has no clothes whatsoever. And we're out of here. This is not a leader. This is a misleader, and a predator. The predator state is really, gone about as far as it can go. And I think the U.S. needs to change its ways. But, Wall Street and the war profiteers are having too much fun. They're not going to notice, which is why the bums really have to be thrown out. Oligarchy does not reform itself. It needs to be shown the door.
Yeah, and I think people really need to fully understand the climate impact in reference to war, but not just war, the military in general. I think a lot of people don't understand this, but this was announced recently. I talked about this on the Community Church for Boston's channel recently. The UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a synthesis report that global emissions need to be slashed in half by 2030. So that's just around the corner. I don't think people understand, how much time we actually have here. And what I want people to also know is that it's not just war. It's not just drone strikes and bombs. It's also military vehicles. This is a piece I think a lot of people are not aware of, because those vehicles actually consume petroleum fuels, and petroleum-based fuels release CO2, nitrogen oxide, hydrocarbons, and carbon monoxide into the atmosphere. Those gases altogether, it actually increases the global temperature. And when the global temperature increases, that's how the ice caps begin to melt. This is a serious, serious issue. And I would challenge anyone who is a climate activist, you really need to start pushing back on politicians that have this rhetoric that is pro-war or that is pro-military, because especially if you're a climate activist, you have to know that the military industrial complex is the biggest contributor to this. So until you do something about that, recycling, like these are good things to do, recycling, compost, those things are still good, but it is very small when you compare it to the effect of the military industrial complex on the environment.
Exactly. Well said. I think, as you're pointing out, the U.S. military is the biggest source of fossil fuels for any organization. And if you're comparing nation states, and they're like almost 200 nations, it comes in at like number 47, something like that. So it's like a whole country, and it's way more than most countries. And because that is the military industrial complex, has such a stranglehold on our government, because they are so in bed with the major political parties, the parties of war and Wall Street. They don't even have to report their emissions, so no one's even keeping track. And the current Biden government is very proud, patting itself on the back and just praising its latest so-called climate bill, the Inflation Reduction Act. But it's so important for people to actually not take them at their word, to understand that, this is part of the, the information warfare, which really pervades all spheres. And if you actually look at the details of that bill, it is really a fossil fuels first bill. It does some good things, yes, but it also just gives away the store to fossil fuels. And when it says that, it's going to spend, I think it's, like $360 billion over 10 years, something like that. It's it's a significant number. It's not what it needs to be, but it's something. And I should check that number. So don't take that as a specific number at this point. But the point I want to make about that is that what they're describing when they talk about all this money that's going to fossil fuel, to climate some of that is actually fossil fuels. And some of those expenditures are actually going for this thing that they call carbon capture. Carbon capture really doesn't exist. It's just an excuse to allow them to keep producing fossil fuels and to reassure people, oh, don't worry, we're going to be able to capture the carbon. Don't worry about it. You know, and they're also putting nuclear under that. And we could have a long discussion about nuclear if need be. But at the end of the day, nuclear, even if it would work, they can't build it in time. The plants are very dangerous. It is energy intensive. It's not nearly as good as renewables. And so what they claim they're solving with the Inflation Reduction Act includes a lot of these false solutions, which are basically just giveaways to the industry, to the nuclear industry and to the fossil fuel industry. And just one infuriating detail from that bill that keeps getting swept under the rug. That bill requires that 60, 80 million, something like this, a huge number, I think it's 80 million acres of offshore water be leased for fossil fuel drilling, and 2 million be leased for onshore drilling every year. In other words, all this stuff has to be leased for drilling before any public lands can be used for large-scale renewable projects like large wind or large solar. You can't do any of that until you have absolutely pillaged our public lands first for fossil fuels. It's, you know, it's just like mind-boggling what is being swept under the rug here under the pretense that this is a climate bill. It's really a fossil fuels first bill. And the rub, the bottom line here is that these levels are not going down. If you look at the level of CO2, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it's constantly going up. And the IPCC, you know, the UN commission that keeps track of these things, in spite of all the good stuff that they do, and they do a lot of good science, it gets watered down at the end of the day. So their reports in all the, 20 years, whatever it is that this has been going on, 30 years, they do not call for a phase out of fossil fuels. They just can't get themselves to say it. And, it's really it's an incredible indictment of this whole process and the liberal climate movement, which has been hijacked by the powers that be. The powers that be are not going to stand up to their corporate sponsors. They're not going to stand up to the political parties that are in bed with fossil fuels and nuclear and the rest. They're just not going to do it. They haven't done it yet. How much longer are you going to wait? It really is, it's the breaking point. And we need to make the breaking point, the tipping point. And like you're pointing out, Sabby, bringing together the climate movement, which is really kind of in the final hours here, bringing together the climate movement, which needs to really stand up and demand transformative change with an eco-socialist Green New Deal. It really needs to be a fundamental sea change in how we do business and what the economy looks like. You're not going to fix this around the margins with, with electric cars. It really needs a plan. It needs public coordination. It needs, public ownership and guidance. We really need to look at this as kind of the last chance on climate in the same way it's the last chance on nuclear. We need to ban nuclear weapons, period. We not only need peace in Ukraine and, the Taiwan-China thing, which is another created conflict. It's another engineered conflict where the US war industry is just making out like bandits. They can't get enough of these kinds of conflicts. Afghanistan went away, so suddenly they had to create new conflicts, and boy, did they ever, they got them. And, that just has to be stopped. And we need an end to the war. We need an end to climate collapse, and we need an end to the exploitation of working people. Because at the end of the day, it's working people, it's unions that are the real driver of transformative change. We need to be able to hold the general strike, and the general strike just doesn't have teeth unless working people are involved, and transportation just isn't going anywhere, like what's happening in France, or the garbage isn't getting picked up, like in France. We need, or the healthcare workers are on strike. We need to have workers who are leading the charge. And fortunately, we have some really enlightened, labor leadership right now. If you look at what the train workers union is calling for, the union that was basically shut down with the leadership of the Democrats, who denied their right to strike for decent working conditions and a predictable schedule and time off so they can maintain their sanity and their families. The Democrats led the charge to destroy their right to strike and make it impossible. But that, the train workers union has been leading the charge in calling for basically public ownership of the railway. And I should correct what I called it. It's the Railroad Workers Union, and it's a combined union across several different railroad corporations. But, they have the big picture, they have the courage, they have the vision. This is the kind of leadership that we need. And between what they're doing, the fight that Starbucks and Amazon is fighting, many of the teachers unions and the nurses unions who are fighting for decent health care and safe staffing, we have some really wonderful leadership. Many of them have called for abandoning the two-party straitjacket as well, which at the end of the day is essential, because if you're going to cave to what the parties are demanding, we'll never get there. We need a political rebellion as well as a rebellion on the social issues.
One of the issues I see we're running into as well is that people or it seems like most Americans are still heavily propagandized in reference to the war empire. It seems like people have not fully woken up from the lies that we were told about the war in Iraq. You would think people would question these conflicts more after that, but people are not. And I want to show you something here. This happened recently. So Jose and a couple of other activists, they have been confronting politicians. This is Nancy Pelosi, about this war in Ukraine. I want to play this piece here because I want you to see just how the audience responds. It seems like a lot of people are still really asleep.
Pelosi, that's a very good place for you in the depths of hell, because for some reason you have a very bad obsession of getting us into war. Hey, why is it that you did not admit that there were no WMDs in Iraq? You brought us into a war in Iraq. You got us into an invasion of Afghanistan. Now over 90% of those people are impoverished and are dying. Why don't you tell the truth about Nord Stream? Why did we destroy Nord Stream? We're leaving millions of Germans without energy. You have a knack for getting us into war. People like you should be arrested. You are.
It's like if you just look at the response from the people in the audience, that tells me that a lot of people are still asleep. And the thing is, he's correct. What he's saying is true, but it's very clear to me that a lot of people are just not, they don't really understand what's going on. And I don't know if it's just because of mainstream media, but I have noticed, like, when you look at the numbers for the Vietnam War protests, there were a lot of people that woke up. We did not have internet during that time. There was no social media. We have more technology now, and more people seem to be asleep than they were back then. Now, some people may say the draft had something to do with that because people were directly impacted by that didn't even sign up to join the military by choice. Some people have said that they showed civilian casualties during the war in Vietnam, and they haven't done that since. So that woke up Americans. But some of the people who were around during that time are still alive today. And you would think they remember. And it seems like they have fallen for the propaganda as well.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-boggling. And I have to say that, you know, Jose was definitely going into the lion's den there, because anybody who's coming out, you know, to hear Nancy Pelosi, I couldn't tell who the other speaker was, but, you know, anybody in their right mind who's not, what should we say, asleep at the wheel, you know, is going to avoid a Nancy Pelosi talk like the plague. You know, it's not like you're going to learn something there. You're just going to hear exactly the same propaganda repeated over and over again. And it's very discouraging to look at demographics like that are just totally sleepwalking their way, you know, into our next, you know, catastrophe. But the polls tell a different story, you know, and that, I think, you know, is kind of the hopeful thing here, that if you look at the, you know, polls that ask, do you identify as a Democrat or a Republican, those numbers are down and down and down. And right now they're about at an all-time low. I think, speaking from memory here, I think it's the high 20s for both. They're pretty similar. They kind of change places a little bit, but they both keep trending down. And the numbers of people who've just like blown them all off and said, you know, I'm throwing in the towel. You guys have thrown me under the bus. Thanks very much. We don't need this. You know, those are bigger and bigger. And the numbers of people who want other political options is growing and growing. So, you know, they, you know, they are on a nonstop propaganda campaign, and it's very hard to find anything on mainstream media that doesn't reinforce their message and kind of tell you that if you have a problem with the war in Ukraine, you know, you're crazy and you're the odd man out. And, you know, it's all designed to kind of pressure people into, what's it called? You know, manufactured consent. It's all about manufacturing consent for war on Wall Street. And, you know, so it's just so important, I think, for people not to listen to it, you know, and to just change what they listen to. They need to be listening to Revolutionary Blackout Network and Sabby's podcast, you know, and lots of independent media, which is doing really great work and is trouncing the, you know, the conventional cable channels and mainstream media and legacy media. Their numbers are going down and down, and the numbers of independent media are off the charts, you know, which is why independent media is under such vicious attack from the mainstream. So, but the question you pose is really right. You know, I think it's important to reject the their conclusion that you know, that we're basically a war culture and you've got to, you know, just deal with it and join it. You know, that is wrong. But it is, you know, it's correct that to say, you know, what changes people's position? You know, how do you get people to rethink this? And during the war in Vietnam, it was easy because, you know, from the get-go, young people opposed the war because we were dying for it, you know, and the draft really brought it home, you know. And then Martin Luther King, being the, you know, the fearless, you know, visionary that he was, you know, he had a huge impact and really helped, I think, the communities of color take a leadership role in fighting the war. So there were some really good things that helped bring that war to an end, but it took a long time, and in the same way in the war in Iraq, initially you were really, vilified if you opposed the war when it began.
Or canceled.
Canceled, yeah, absolutely. Whereas the people who were driving us into that war, they haven't been canceled, they haven't been tried as war criminals, as aiding and abetting, the horrific war crime really of the century. So, the media is a huge problem. I think it's really important for us, not only to encourage people to be watching good media, real people's media, but also for us to help have these conversations, and to be talking about it. And for me, the themes that are most powerful and the easiest way to break through is to talk about how the war is hurting you, the person that you're talking to, how the war is hurting you, how the war is really what's driving inflation, whether it's the disrupted supply chain or the inflation. The war is hurting you economically and is also putting every one of us at risk for nuclear Armageddon. And, the doomsday clock, it's closer to midnight than it has ever been in all, 50, 60 years, whatever, that it's been around. It's closer than ever. And the more details you learn about this, the more absolutely, chilling it is. Daniel Ellsberg, you may know, he kind of gained fame around exposing the lies and the deception in the Vietnam War. And his whistleblowing was very much a part of how we stopped the war. It really helped to have the proof, and then it really helped to have the success of the Vietnamese, who really showed in the I forget what it was called, but there was a big resurgence of the Viet Cong, who showed that the war was not going away, and that they were as strong as ever. And that really triggered a flip in public opinion. And at that point, suddenly it was really easy to just shut it down. But it took years to get there. And that was a much easier case to make because I think because of the draft. And as you point out, because of the media coverage was much better. Daniel Ellsberg was a part of that media effort. And he, he's known for blowing the whistle on the war in Vietnam, but his real, commitment was to blow the whistle on nuclear weapons. And his most recent book, was The Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. And it's absolutely chilling to see what was going on even then. And it's far worse now. And the danger is much greater now. And I think, this is something that we're only beginning to talk about in detail. And, I think it's really important for us to help educate each other. I personally, the first organization I was ever involved with, this was like way back when in my student days, was actually Physicians for Social Responsibility. And that organization is all about educating people about nuclear weapons. After a while, I realized you can't just educate people. Education will only get you so far. You also have to, follow the, the resistance mode as well. It takes both. But for a long time, I was very kind of dedicated to studying what is the nuclear threat about and how do we convey this to people. And, here it is again, and it's back and bigger than ever. And I think there's a huge role right now for what Physicians for Social Responsibility is doing, and other groups, the ban, the nuclear ban organization too, which is all about not only educating people, but really pushing the nuclear weapons ban. And you may know that the US has dismantled most nuclear treaties. The key treaties are gone. We've sort of been laying the groundwork here. This is why we can put missiles on Russia's border that Russia's freaked out about. We haven't put nuclear missiles on Russia's border, but we have put missiles that can be swapped out very quickly. We've put nuclear compatible missiles on their border. Those missiles are supposedly defense. They are anti-missiles, supposedly. They're like the missiles that, oh, don't worry, this is just to put up a shield. So that used to be illegal. The ABM treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, it stopped anti-missiles from being put in, these nuclear shield missiles. That now is used. That treaty was destroyed by the US so that we could make more money, basically, so that the weapons industry could make more money peddling anti-missiles. So we're putting in anti-missiles, selling them as though they are going to be a solution, which they're not. I mean, even if they weren't swapped out, they don't stop missiles. They're not reliable. They don't work very well. But in addition, the huge danger is that they can be swapped out very easily. They can be installed as a missile defense, and then suddenly, whoop, it's no longer missile defense. It's actually missile offense. And it now contains a nuclear warhead. These are nuclear compatible missiles, which are now sitting on Russia's border. The reason that the US can now get away with that is because we dismantled that treaty. The ABM treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, would have stopped it. George Bush tore that treaty apart back in 2002. So that's why we can get away with putting missiles on Russia's border, which Russia is freaked out about. In the same way we freaked out about it back during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Russia was putting missiles at Cuba's request, because Cuba had just been invaded by the US in the Bay of Pigs. So Cuba requested Russia's defense with nuclear missiles. We freaked out, and we had basically a nuclear war that we were ready to launch. We were in launch mode for a nuclear war. So Russia attacking Ukraine in order to get rid of those missiles is kind of like us way back in the 1960s when we were ready. I think we actually had the planes in the air ready to drop the bombs. We were ready to go to nuclear war, except the difference was that back then we had leadership that wasn't brain dead. And Khrushchev and Kennedy said, holy shit, we better sit down and talk about this. We cannot have a nuclear war. So they did. They began to negotiate. And these were those famous, whatever it was, 19 days, something like that, where the clock was ticking down to midnight. And they basically, they agreed that Russia would take its missiles out of Cuba and the US would take its missiles out of Turkey. And the US wanted that secret. They didn't want it known that we had put missiles in Turkey, and that's what, in part what Russia was responding to. So Russia agreed to let the US save face, and and they kept quiet about taking their missiles out. But, we've been here before, and Russia's, just hysteria about missiles on its border is completely understandable. We were in the same place exactly. And the missiles that we have placed there, we did so because we destroyed the nuclear treaties.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting too. Journalist Seymour Hersh, he wrote an article recently revealing that it was actually the U.S. that blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. And he's received heavy criticism, as you can imagine, from mainstream media and from the White House press as well. But I want to remind people who Seymour Hersh is, because people tend to forget this, that he was actually the journalist that gained popularity after he published the story about the My Lai massacre, which was about there were U.S. troops in Vietnam and they were killing unarmed Vietnamese people. He broke that story. And back then, it seems like great renowned journalist, congratulations, so proud of you. But now it's like mainstream media and other journalists are smearing him because of the information he's revealing about the United States government this time around. But it seems like they didn't have that resentment towards him when he revealed that information. I mean, I wasn't alive back then, but that's what it seems like. I think some people don't understand this isn't someone who just became a journalist yesterday. He's won numerous awards and he's done great work. And the White House still really isn't addressing that article the way that they should. Other politicians have been approached and confronted about it, like Hakeem Jeffries. They don't want to talk about it. The only statement that I saw is they said it's utterly false and complete fiction, but they do not want to talk about this, Jill. And it is very revealing.
It sure is. And, a case in point is that the UN Security Council just had a proposal. It was proposed by Russia that the UN investigate Nord Stream because this is an international crime. This is international terrorism. And for the UN and everybody else to just look the other way says, okay, go ahead, anybody, blow up any underwater infrastructure. And those are like transcontinental cables. It's a lot of the internet. It's wind power. They're kind of like saying, hey, it's just a thumbs up to any kind of sabotage of infrastructure, and this was like billions and billions worth of infrastructure. And they're not even trying to get to the bottom of it. So this proposal from Russia was met with, the vote is really revealing, because it was Russia, China, and Brazil that supported it. Everybody else abstained. What does that tell you about U.S. strong arming? They don't come out against it. Who in their right mind would be against it? But they were pressured, presumably, you can be pretty sure they're all pressured not to vote for it. And why, their reason for this, their public reason was that, oh, don't worry, because Denmark, I think Norway, maybe Germany, there are 3 countries that are already investigating it. Well, actually, their investigations are secret and they won't share the results of their investigation. So at every turn, this is just an orchestrated scam to protect the perpetrator. Who would oppose an investigation of this most horrific act of terrorism that has resulted in energy shortage all over the world and escalating energy prices and therefore food prices? This has been an absolute disaster, especially for the economy of Germany, which is now losing a lot of its businesses because it doesn't have energy to support them. This is a catastrophe for the economy, especially of Germany, but all of the EU. And who would not want to know the answer to that? The only person who wouldn't want to know the answer is the culprit who did it. And we are doing everything we can to prevent the investigation from taking place. It's really such a blatant, self-incrimination going on.
Yes, it is. Have you noticed any of the anti-Russia sentiment? I'm having flashbacks of a post 9/11 when there was an anti-Islamic sentiment in this country. After that, now it seems like if you even people who work for RT per se, journalists who are traveling to Russia to cover the story, people who are talking about the narrative a little bit differently, people who are Russian, like Americans, it seems like this is happening all over again, where there's this anti Russia sentiment. And this is one of the problems with war as well. It gives the impression that especially when the US government's involved, it gives the impression that the US government or NATO is in the right and the opposing country is the enemy. And regardless of the war, the US government tends to make it appear to be that the US government is actually the hero. We're on the good side, and the opposing country is to blame or is the enemy. And what tends to happen from that is that people who are from that country can be treated unfairly in this country or smeared. I mean, I'm seeing them call journalists Putin puppets who don't support the war at all. Medea Benjamin calling for, peace in Ukraine. They're smearing people who are calling for peace. They're calling them Putin puppets. I mean, people have really lost it. they really have. But it's scary because for me, I remember anti-Russia sentiment going all the way back to when I was a kid. It was always Russia bad, Russia's cold and angry. And you might know this here, but there's a facility here called the Maparium for people who are not aware. If you go to the Maparium, it's a giant globe, right, of the world. You walk into the globe and there's like this voice that speaks to you and talks about different countries. When it gets to Russia, all of a sudden the music turns very cold and it goes, ah. I'm like, what happened there? Like it's so negative when compared to how they talk about the other countries.
Yeah, it's so sad, and Russian artists are being canceled, and conductors, are having they're being fired and their concerts are being canceled in this country. Yeah, I mean, it's just McCarthyism all over. The media is certainly driving this. There's this public delusion that there's a good guy in a white hat and there's a bad guy in a black hat, and this is kind of how our corporate media works. And, it's really remarkable. I try to listen. My husband likes to watch PBS NewsHour, which makes me want to scream all the time. But I'm always listening to see, like, do they know what they're talking about? And the talking heads that they bring on, are they persuasive? And I have to say, they generally don't know what they're talking about, or they are kind of suspiciously funded in a way that, no one in their right mind would give them credence. And so you have the feeling that we just have this media apparatus which is doing its job, its job. In my mind, there is a press doing the real work of journalism. There's a press, and then there's an oppress that's really oppressing people with their information warfare and their sense of loyalty and their career advancement aims, which is, again, what is being taught now a lot in journalism school, that you're supposed to, advance up the ladder. And I can't say all journalism schools are doing that. I don't, it's not a field I know very well, but this is certainly what I hear. And you see this in so many people who come out of journalism school that, I don't know, maybe because they have a debt to repay, they're looking for the good jobs so they can pay their student debt, and just abandon the principles of journalism, which is supposed to be about, what's the phrase? Comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. They've got it backwards. It's about comforting the comfortable and afflicting the afflicted. That's what they do in all realms, whether it's foreign policy or, or the economy or the climate. They're all about playing the game. It's just this very primitive notion of it's like a football team, it's like a sports event, and you're just like loyal to your tribe. And so many of them, so many journalists, professional journalists now are coming from, solid upper classes and are coming from an economic elite. So they don't see it, they don't see the story to start with. And it becomes this very self-reinforcing crisis. And, if you look at public polls again about what do people think about the media, and how do people, are people confident? Do they have trust in media? And absolutely they don't. It's down near single digits, maybe in the 10s or 20, at most. People are not trusting media, and they feel like they've been abandoned. And our kind of public sentiment about the war is just a reflection of this very superficial and self-serving coverage by the elitist media.
I agree.
Go RBN, and people need to be listening to a real discussion, what we get from Aaron Mate or Glenn Greenwald, Gray Zone, just there's great alternative stuff out there, and you don't have to agree with it all. But, you ought to start trying to mix it up and actually trying to understand what's going on, and just don't take their word for it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I have 2 more questions for you, Jill. You tweeted this. This is actually connected to another story I'm going to discuss tonight as well. But for people who are not aware, the war in Yemen is ending. So this is huge news for those of you that did not know. One of the things I'm going to point this out twice tonight, but if you go on Twitter right now and you like this tweet, you exit Twitter and you come back in, Twitter is removing the likes from this tweet. They're doing this thing with Substack. I'll get into that story later on tonight. They're trying to not have Substack links in anymore. But what people need to understand, even though this war in Yemen is ending, is that the people in that country are devastated. I've seen so many videos from independent journalists that have actually gone over there to Yemen. That country is destroyed. People are living in rubble, not to mention the environmental pollution that they're having to deal with. The air is toxic. Mm-hmm. So even though the war is ending, we're looking at people that live in that country to have health problems for the next coming years because of the pollution that they're going to be taking in.
Mm. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, just the numbers of people that are at risk right now from starvation, and the malnutrition in just like a whole generation of children is just staggering. And the cost of rebuilding Yemen is just unbelievable. And you remind me of a question, when you're talking about the likes are being removed from that tweet. It would be so great if Matt Taibbi would expand his probe. In other words, he's been looking at how the liberal democratic establishment is censoring Republicans. I wish he would also look at how the liberal democratic establishment is censoring actual progressives. Now that Matt Taibbi has left the Democratic Party, it would be very nice if he helped shine some light on political alternatives and how those alternatives are being systematically suppressed. And it's not just partisan alternatives, but, the peace advocates, and the real climate activists, how we also are being censored, canceled, and destroyed on social media. We've been destroyed on legacy media for decades. That's nothing new. But there was a time when, I remember when it actually happened. We used to have a much bigger following and circulation of our social media, our tweets and our Facebook posts. And then all of a sudden, this was, I think, in 2017, if I'm not mistaken, we lost access on Twitter for like 24 hours. And when we came back on, suddenly our reach was down by like 75%. Suddenly it came crashing down. So it was as if suddenly they weren't going to let us be heard anymore. And I would really like to know, are we being shadow, what's the word, shadow censored, whatever. Yeah, are we being shadow? And it'd be nice to know that for our journalists, for our activists. I wish Matt Taibbi would expand his queries a little bit to see what else is going on.
Yeah, there were a couple of suggestions I gave him. One was Tara Reid. I think she is significantly suppressed. The other one was, I think it was Yemen. Yeah, Yemen was one of them. So was Syria. He did look up Syria, so he did talk about that. There were a couple ones, suggestions that I did give him in reference to that. Although based on the information that came from him today on Twitter, I don't know if Matt is going to be continuing this. There's some crazy things happening over at Twitter, Jill. The Substack thing is a big one. A lot of journalists rely on Substack. It's the only way they can get their voice out there. So for Elon Musk to make this decision, I know that's something that Matt tweeted about. I'll talk about that later as well. But I mean, it's just, I don't even know if the Twitter files are going to continue because of other things that have happened recently, especially with the interview that he had with Mehdi Hassan. I don't know what Elon's thinking, or I think he's trying to make money. I really do. I think he's trying to make money, but this idea that Elon was going to be pro free speech, we're seeing that's not necessarily the case.
Oh yeah, that's for sure. And I think it's never been, what shall we say, probable that Elon was going to be a free speech guru, but it seemed like he was at least willing to allow some things to be done. And while Matt has has an option to dig around in there and see what's going on, it certainly is, it's certainly helpful. I don't know what kind of compromises he has to make, or if it's just that he's being attacked as being a sellout for dealing with, I don't know how he is, how are the Twitter files enhancing Elon Musk's fortune, his investment, or his status? I don't know that it's doing that, but it certainly is, shining some daylight on what is actually going on in social media. And I think that's really important. And I don't see a downside to his continuing to do that while he's still able, but maybe there's much more going on than I'm aware of.
Yeah, there's he's being heavily attacked right now after that interview he had with Mehdi Hassan, which when he announced that was going to happen, I was like, oh no, that's a trap. That is definitely a trap. All right, Jill, I have one more question for you. You probably have heard this already, but Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has announced that he is running for president. Both of us are in Massachusetts. We know the Kennedys are very beloved. He's a little bit different, kind of like black sheep of the family. So not as many people like him. Do you feel he's making the right decision? Now, he is one of those people that is anti-authoritarian. He's very vocal about these government agencies. He's been very vocal about the mandates and the lockdowns and all of those things, but he's running through the Democratic Party. And that was the part that really confused me, because I'm like, you realize you're running in a party that's doing all those things, right?
Yeah. I mean, to me, that decision really limits what he can accomplish, because he's, and there's some things that I greatly value about his work, and there's some things I don't agree with. But that said, I think dialogue and debate is a good thing. And he can't do very much inside the Democratic Party because they have the ability to just totally shut him down. So it's not going anywhere. And it does make me question, what is his strategy that he's still a part of the Democratic Party and sees himself as a Democrat? That just makes me not have a lot of confidence in his strategy or his politics. Is this just an exercise? Maybe it is. Maybe it is. And maybe but it's so misguided, because he's going to take a huge amount of abuse, and he's really not going to be able to get much in return by way of having a dialogue or a debate. It's just not going to happen. It's going to be totally shut down. So I feel badly for him. And I think he's going to be attacked because he is a Kennedy. He's going to be attacked with just incredible fervor and brutality. So I think he's likely to get very beat up. He's already been very, very beat up, but I think it's going to get a whole lot worse. And I worry for him.
Yeah. For people who don't live here and don't fully know, the Kennedys are a big deal here. Very big deal. There's a lot of them. Some of them that you have not heard about.
When I ran for governor for the first time in Massachusetts in the 2002 election, all the living Kennedys came out to say a vote for Stein is a vote for Romney. And, you know, that was kind of like my close experience. That's as close as I ever got to the Kennedys, was they're coming out to say, you know, if you're not a Democrat, then you're a Republican and you're helping the Republicans. And I was not impressed with their political insight.
I hear you. I hear you. Well, Jill, thank you so much for coming on.
Great talking with you as always, Sabby. It's a real honor, privilege, and I look forward to the next time.
Thank you
for all you're doing. Take care.